grief is um, such a part of this whole process for us. Uh, waking up, waking up to our true nature, which initially means waking up to the nature of being itself, the nature of consciousness as everything, as the entirety of experience, all the twists and turns of experience, the ups and downs of experience being this seamless experience of consciousness, sometimes rather oceanic, sometimes experienced as a sense of pure being. And that's a big initial shift often for people. Um, with that, there's often a sense of release, a sense of wonder, a sort of surprising sense that I don't know what changed. It's as if nothing specific changed, but the overall feel is just completely different. You know, I can look at any specific thing and it seems like it looked before. The narrative of my life hasn't really changed. I still kind of do the same things. I have the same body, same name, seem to have the same history, but I feel completely different. You know, things feel different. Things feel lighter in a way that's even hard to describe. You know, even that is a sort of poetic description, but different. And this, this really is grace. This is that wonderful gift from the universe that just says you're not here to suffer, and for the first time in life that it's possible to live without ongoing suffering, or just a sense of carrying around something heavier than necessary, a sense of struggle. So we just suddenly realize, wow, that's actually not part of life. Maybe it's something I was doing kind of without realizing it, innocent mistake. Maybe it was just some, I don't know, program I inherited in the operating system of consciousness that was an unnecessary program, and it was running in the background and causing unnecessary struggle, but it's not part of the real operating system, let's say, or it's not part of the natural reality. And so we feel so relieved by this, right? It's such a relief. Um, but we often with this, we don't often feel like a bunch of grief right away. Because all we're really letting go of is a bunch of struggle. All we're really letting go of is a lot of suffering. Um, usually is how it feels. But over time, you know, after sort of honeymoon period, often of a few months or whatever, it's different for everyone, but we start to notice emotion being much more uh, prominent emotion, sensation, emotional pain. We just notice them being more prominent, to make it as simple as possible. And really the reason is because we've stopped disassociating constantly, right? Before the shift, the in my experience, the feeling of something just not being right with life is really just because of the disassociation. We were just a little disassociated all the time, or most of the time. We were always trying to pull back from life without realizing it. And that is uncomfortable. It's inherently uncomfortable. And so that not being there, the tendency to pull away from everything all the time, not being there is such a relief. We find ourselves just, emerging from everything and merging with everything seamlessly. It's just natural. It's the natural way, right? It's a very beautiful time. But there's a gap between that and coming into much more direct contact with what we were actually trying to avoid. Now, when I say we were trying to avoid it, there you could infer a lot from that that's not really there. You could infer that we are intentionally trying to avoid it. You could infer that there's some reason to avoid it. You could have infer that there's something that's so terrible that it needs to be avoided. None of those are actually true, but the avoidance mechanism itself is very strong, until we break that spell. So the avoidance mechanism itself being upheld constantly sort of sends the message to our mind, to our unconscious, that there's a reason we need to avoid. There's something down here that's, it's just accursed. Something at this core of who I am that's so terrible that I need to hide it from everybody all the time, right? So this comes with a sense of hiding and stuff that happens in human communication and all that, right? But none of it really points to any person at the center of it that's problematic. None of it really points to anything actual in the universe that's that's the cause of that suffering. Um, all it really points to is a habit pattern that's been going on for some time. Um, and as that reverses naturally, we just start to feel very directly. And as simple as that statement is, um, the process of learning to feel fully is not as easy as we would think it would be if we were told this ahead of time and could even process it. Turns out it's actually a little more challenging than it sounds. And that's not even because of anything to do with the feel itself, the feeling, the sensations. Again, it just has to do with habit, has to do with habit force. So the first thing we often notice is the mind just goes crazy sometimes. The mind just gets really revved up, starts throwing us dark thoughts and confused thoughts and um, mental struggle and mind storms and all that. That tends to happen earlier on as we come back into contact with ourself, for lack of a better way of saying it. And then that's maybe the early phase. The middle phase is a sort of bit of a roller coaster where it's like profound presence and dropping in, spontaneity, peace, the that which you woke up to in the first place is just here, clearly couldn't be other than being here, and then crashing back into like an intense emotion and recognizing it as such. Oh man, I'm feeling so much grief here. I'm feeling so much anger and frustration, and and so there's that kind of like up and down, back into the intense emotions or the contraction, and then you know back out into this just simple clarity that's just always here, right? That's kind of the middle phase. And then in the deeper phase, it becomes rather energetic. Can be described as physical. The body goes through a lot sometimes, and you may have kundalini. You may incorporate somatic practices, and you may just come up with your own somatic practices because you just know, you can just feel the body needs to move a certain way, and so we learn all that. But it's a little bit more like I was talking about at the beginning of this call, where it's just full on in response to someone's question. It's just full on. It's no coping mechanisms left. There's no one to disassociate so much anymore. It's just like when you feel anger, you are anger. You feel it as your whole body, kind of. When you are sadness, you feel sadness as your whole body. Um, so so that's like kind of the later phase where it's very energetic, very direct. We lose our ability to disassociate effectively, at least, and it's also intermixed with these periods of sort of spontaneity and peace and just flow that feels entirely natural. And I'll say now it's a little less of a roller coaster. It's a little more like um, they're kind of interwoven. They start to become more and more interwoven. The experience of contraction, the experience of expansion, it starts to be a little hard to even know the difference, right? The experience of inside and outside, it starts to be difficult to know the difference. The experience of bliss and the experience of absolute helplessness start to actually feel the same, and that's very strange, right? So things start to coalesce at this third, I don't know, iteration of the way we encounter the shadow and work with the shadow and work through the shadow and incorporate the shadow. Um, with all of this, I think maybe sort of second and third part in the way I broke this up. Second and third part of the stages of this shadow progression is when we start to feel a lot of grief. And it's intermittent sometimes. We may feel a little bit here, a little bit there. We may just get a big wave of grief at one point and then it just drops out. But we certainly become familiar with it, the experience of grief. Now, I'll use a few different terms because you may not describe it the same way, or you may not experience it the same way as someone else. Grief often sort of suggests that we've lost somebody close to us, but we can experience grief with the loss of with identity. We can experience grief with the loss of health. We can experience grief in a lot of ways. Other people just feel this sense of something just really dropping away, just dissolving away, dropping away. Feels very physical, visceral, and energetic, but they may not call it grief. Sometimes it's very personal. It may feel like an intense sadness. You may not know why it's there. You may know why it's there. It may be specific to some relationship situation. It may be specific to the loss of a loved one. It can be all kinds of things, but it does feel very personal and very much like my sadness. But all of these experiences, I think, are on a spectrum. They're all sort of related to the same phenomenon, and it's so strange because it really is, in a sense, in a very real sense, the grief of losing something that never was. We we grieve losing a loved one, or we grieve losing someone who's special in our life, and at the same time, we're waking up to the truth of non-duality, the truth of non-separation, that there's nothing that could ever be apart. And we're not just waking up to that intellectually, we're feeling it. So this is a very strange territory to navigate sometimes, because the feeling of grief can be so intense, and yet the knowing of interconnectedness, that nothing has ever been apart in any way that I can even perceive it apart, is coming online and becoming so obvious. So yeah, so this is where they kind of interweave with one another, the insight of non-duality, the deeper insight of non-duality, which becomes um, sort of personal and impersonal simultaneously, and the feeling of loss, the feeling of loss of uh, everything external, everything that seems like a part, the loss of uh, agency, the loss of the sense of being the one that's choosing, the loss of the sense of having an inner world to run away into, to be able to disassociate into. You can grieve the loss of that as well. Uh, but I will say, with all of these, there's a thread that weaves it all together, and it's the fear, or not even the fear, the experience, I should say, of the loss of control, the loss of the belief that I can imagine the world to be the way I want it to be, and by doing that, impel the world to be the way I want it to be. That the belief it could be different has any weight or sway over reality whatsoever. That's a big loss. For some of us more than for others, but for all of us, that's going to be a hit to take. That, yeah, I don't have control over life in any way at all. I can't make it do what I want it to do. I also can't make it do something different than it already did. By the time we notice anything, it's done. By the time we notice what's happening, it's happened, right? To record anything in consciousness, to have an image in consciousness, a reflective image of what seemed to have happened or occurred, uh, by definition means it's already happening. It's already done. The film is in the can. So so we really fool ourselves about this for a long time. We insist, even with realization sometimes, even with deep realization sometimes, we insist that no, I still can be in control in certain ways. Um, it's all habit. It's just habit. We don't really try to do that, but we may conveniently overlook that we are doing that. That, sure, most areas I can see that there's no sense of agency, and doership is really a mental construct. And yet there's some things I just want to hold on to that I can't hold on to. There's some things I want to be different that can't be different. There's some things I want to be here that just aren't here. And that, confronting that as directly as possible, is really the key to getting under grief finally, to seeing through the problem of birth and death, to seeing through the problem of existence seeming to be equivalent to suffering. Existence is not equivalent to suffering, but for a long time, we'll have an association there until we see fully, thoroughly, and unequivocally through the illusion of control. And again, I can break down what control means in a very simple way. Control is simply saying, this is the way the world is appearing right now, and here's the way I want it to appear. And I can believe this enough that I actually feel like that should be doing what I think it should be doing. The world should be doing what I think it should be doing just because I can think it. It's just not true. There's just no way for that to be true. It's never going to be true, and it never was, and it never will be. And it will always lead to some form of suffering. And interestingly, if you look at like the fetter model, this would be the 10th fetter. This is essentially the final fetter that's the fundamental illusion underneath everything. And that is ignorance. They call it ignorance, but the ignorance is based and rooted in the illusion of a separate, abiding self in time, apart from everything, that has volition, has choice, and can make the world turn in. It can turn the world into something that makes itself more comfortable, that makes it avoid pain, and that makes it, accumulate pleasure. That's the entity that we create in the mind, with the complexity of the mind, to do the bidding of this fundamental misperception that I can make reality do what I want it to do, that my preferences are actually somehow mitigating pain and somehow accumulating pleasure. They just aren't. You can still have preferences, by the way. This doesn't mean you don't have preferences, because that's just fooling yourself to say I don't prefer sushi over, I don't know, dog food or something. The preferences can still be there, but there's a vast difference between having preferences, between merely having preferences, and having preferences associated with the belief that I can actually control the world and the environment to bring my preferences to fruition. That's the illusion. That's the fundamental illusion. And, I say it in a lot of different ways. A lot of good teachers have said, Adyashanti has said it in many different ways. But when we convince ourselves that the world could be other than it is, we suffer. When there's no sense of the world having to be other than it is, we don't suffer. We just don't suffer. We're in flow. We're in concert. We're not experiencing boundaries. We're not experiencing an illusory separate self. We're not experiencing gain and loss. We're not experiencing struggle. All of those we can be without, actually. We may still experience basic emotion. The body may experience pain, illness, old age, death. It will. That's all normal. That's all natural. But there doesn't have to be added struggle, added beliefs that things should be other or could be other than they are. And that's essentially the end of grief. Again, there can still be sadness, but it'll be very momentary. A very simple, basic emotion, a body response to the environment can happen. But the overwhelm of grief, the overwhelm of loss, the overwhelm of the world just not being fair, we can actually move beyond that. And it's a hard one to see through, because because we identify with the lens. We identify with the lens that's looking at the world, painting something over it, saying, this is how it could be. We forget that we can actually set the lens aside and just see, this is how it is. It's like, and we can do that for a time, right? We can say, well, this is how it is, and I'm good with that. But as soon as certain conditions arise, we grab that lens back. We go, no, I want to see how it could be, actually. I'd rather see how it could be than how it is right now. And that will lead to suffering. And then we set it down and we stop suffering. And we pick it up again and we suffer. And we set it down and we stop suffering. It's called the sufferingogram. It's like a kaleidoscope of suffering. You look through it and it turns everything into suffering. It's augmented reality, except only just makes you see suffering. So, and that's the long and short of it when it comes to suffering and grief and control and loss and the end of it. There are all kinds of adjunctive modalities, things that can help when you're feeling the intensity of it, of course. But I really think it comes back to a couple things when it comes to anything in the emotion body. And one is direct experience, feeling, noticing the thoughts as you feel, and asking yourself, what is this without that perception? And you might see an image of something that you want to be here that's not here, or you might see an image of anything that triggers or causes intensity of suffering, and you tell yourself, okay, there's a thought. That's okay. That's an image. It's a mental image. What is here? And just drop right back into that sensation. So that's one very important tool that is valuable with any emotional intensity, anything in the shadow space, any of it. The other tool, and these have many forms, but the other tool is inquiry around belief. What are my beliefs about this situation? And look for the shoulds and shouldn'ts. Those will calm the fire of frustration so much. It shouldn't be this way. Do I actually believe that? Wow, I believe it shouldn't be this way. What is the cost of that? Gosh, it cost me so much. What is the benefit of it? There's no benefit. It doesn't do anything. Wow, that person should be this way, or that person shouldn't be this way. What does it do when I believe that? To me, what does it do to them? Well, they probably don't even know, but I know, I feel it. I can feel the resistance, So anyway, this is a very simple way of talking about belief inquiry, but inquiry around beliefs when it comes to shadow work, emotion, et cetera, is the other side of the coin, I think, but it's both of those are very valuable. So moving through grief, moving through intensity of any kind of, emotion, both of these, spending some time in each can be very helpful. But when it comes down to it, when all is said and done, the direct experience, if you can remain there with just the sensation, it has infinite capacity. You have the capacity for anything, for any kind of experience. And it's pretty surprising actually how infinite that capacity actually is. But it's also, it can be surprising how distorting one thought can be. One tendency to pull back up into the mind, to disassociate, starts to become much more uncomfortable at this stage. So it really just becomes about abiding in sensation, abiding in, then it's sensation and the visual. When we have non-dual realization on board, it's like sensation is also sound and the colors and forms and shapes. And then as we were describing before, it becomes synesthetic, and can become deeply peaceful. But even in the deep peace, we don't hold peace as an ideal. We don't think peace should be here. We simply notice it. And there could be a contraction. Of course there could. There could also be something intense. There could be emotion moving through. There could be a situation that we hadn't experienced and does cause some contraction, and we, move through that as well. And the peace does tend to just get deeper and deeper through all experiences.